Awesome. I'm Fabio Ronaldo, he, him pronouns. I've been living in Vermont for about 3 years. My background, I started off as an educator, then transitioned into youth development work, and then did my grad school work in conflict resolution. And I'm working right now as a resident dean at Landmark College. Grew up as a queer kid, still am today. And yeah, I definitely see the value of this work significantly, and specifically this more research around this and hearing these voices. So I appreciate being a part of this project.
So this project is part of Mount Escutney Prevention Partnership's efforts this year around creating more inclusive and welcoming communities for LGBTQ plus youth, as well as adults. And we really want to get some perspectives from different folks who have both personal and professional perspectives on how best to support LGBTQ plus youth in our communities, as well as what these youth bring to these communities.
Is there any other questions that you have for us before we start the interview?
None that come to mind, but if they come up, I'll definitely share.
All right, great. So my first couple questions are more general. The first one being, what do queer and trans kids and youth need from their communities?
That's a loaded question. But definitely, I think that the first thing I always think of when coming into this work is that our work should be very much intersectional. So taking into consideration that our queer and trans youth definitely come with queer and trans experiences, but they're also very unique along with their needs. Specifically in the work that I do at Landmark College, we're a school for neurodivergent students. So everyone's needs are so individual. But when I think of kind of the basics of community, it's belongingness, it's the ability to be one's full self. And when I talk about belongingness, I like to think of belongingness more than just like telling someone they belong in a space. I think belongingness is really about when they're absent, when they're not in the space, do you recognize that they're not there? And for me, that's really belongingness, when you see their absence and their need to fill space. So when I think of kind of what the basics are that I feel that our queer and trans youth need, it's that safe space and know that they belong there and that they're needed there.
Yeah, thank you. I did not know. I actually didn't know anything about that college, but I am neurodivergent myself, so that's really cool.
Dope. Yeah, we've been here. I've been here this is my second year here. And it's magical to really kind of understand the many intersections of neurodivergency and how it plays out. It really broke the mold of what I thought. We have these ways of thinking of what people should be like and how they should be and how they should act. And my experience here has just really tore that wall down to remind and to circle back to this conversation that people are so unique, and it's so hard to put them in a box because we're not meant to be in one.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Fabio, I'm really curious, your first response was that it's a loaded question. Can you say a little bit more about what is loaded about it for you?
Yeah, for me it was about I hate to generalize and say that one group of people just needs this. So for me, when I meant loaded is because I truly believe that everyone's needs are individual, but there also are pretty universal needs that everyone has. So for me, that was what I meant by loaded question.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, such a great point, because just to ask that question assumes that there's something we can assume that this whole group has in common.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Another question that we had was, what do queer and trans kids and youth bring to their communities?
Oh, I like this question. My personal belief is that queer and trans kids are magical. They bring more than just their own lived experience. They bring a reminder of, what's the word? I find them to be living embodiments of what the world can really offer. I don't know if I'm saying that the right way. I'll use me as an example. I always as a queer POC, my existence is my revolution. Like me existing in a space is how I change the system. So like when I see queer and trans folks specifically in places of leadership and in taking up space in spaces, like I see that as revolution and tearing down the system. So for me, I think that queer and trans kids bring that, whether they recognize it or not. You know, that's our life journey of not finding our voice, but being given the space to share our voice. That's one of the big things that I see that they bring. Their existence, their being, their taking up space, brings so much that folks don't recognize. And in my experience working with queer and trans youth is that what they're asking for is just what everyone else has access to already, you know? So that's kind of one of the main things that I bring. They bring diversity of thought, they bring diversity of experience. I was able to, I facilitated in grad school, I was able to facilitate a research study around how male identifying folks viewed their masculinity. And it was great to kind of get the queer perspective. I had a couple students that identified as queer in that space, and their perspective really made for there to be some really transformative learning on behalf of those who were not within that identity. You know, we live in a system where my queer experience is not something that is readily open for discussion. You know, it's not really welcomed in all spaces. So in spaces where there is room for that voice, there's so much learning that can come from that. And not so much on the part of the storyteller, but also on the part of the story listener, you know? I know that was a little jumbled, but yeah.
No, that's totally fine. It's a great answer. I really like that question too. I didn't even write it. I think it's a great question, you know, because I think a lot of times we do focus on what people need, which is, it is really important. But like, we should also be talking about, you know, what queer and trans kids bring, and like, you know, because they are magical.
They are.
Absolutely.
They are. And I think that life is about supporting them, for them to recognize what they bring. Because again, to circle back to that phrase, like their existence is for me revolution and revolt. Them just taking up space, that's all they need to do.
Thank you.
I did write the question, and I wrote it just because it's like the default of the thing you do in a like strengths-based approach or whatever, and I wasn't thinking too hard about it. And then when we started to ask it, every time we ask that question, someone's face just lights up every single time. It's so cool.
Yeah.
It really is.
Oh.
Yeah. So another question I had was, what would you say to well-meaning adults in the community who are new to thinking about gender and sexuality and aren't sure what to do or say?
It's a great question also. I find that some of those options really depends on kind of how are they going about the work. And I always feel that the best first step is always to listen to the voices around you, and do some research. I find that people today are they get so anxious of like saying the wrong thing, and how do I engage if I don't know, when it's not about being an expert in queer and trans theory. It's about going back to our human nature of just seeing people for who they are, you know. And if people don't know, do some research. You know, I don't like it when folks put the onus on minoritized communities to educate, you know, and it's the responsibility of those in not in those groups to do their own work, you know, and ask questions with other allies. I've had some tough experiences where folks are like, you have to give me all the answers. And I'm like, no, I don't. You need to do your own work on your own, and don't process with me, you know, find another ally. I think a lot of unintended harm happens when that process is not followed correctly, but I do encourage folks that are in professional fields to do the work. It's 2020. There's so much stuff on the internet and so much content and so much webinars. With COVID, people are pumping out these videos. So like there's content out there, but the question is, are you willing to do the work? Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you. And so how would you support queer and trans youth who may not be out to their parents?
We encounter a lot of that on campus, a lot. In college settings is where you really get to explore who you are outside of the constraints of your parents. And it's my responsibility to respect that. I don't think there's any I'm all about letting folks define their own process. So if I have a queer or trans student that makes me aware that they haven't come out to their family, so that means the onus is on me, the responsibility is on me to make sure that the correspondence that I send out doesn't carry the name that they identify with today. Making sure that in everything in my responsibility, I have to hold kind of two worlds where I respect their choice and where they are. And I also have to respect their anonymity. Oh, I hate that word. I have to keep where they are anonymous in a lot of cases, so I have to really walk this line. So the responsibility is on me, and I encourage folks who are also in those situations that it's not an if or but, we have to respect where they are and respect confidentiality. So that means specifically with I have a lot of trans students, so it's kind of knowing what name they identify with now, and also knowing their dead name. And unfortunately, I have to use that as per their request when it comes to family and parents. So that's my responsibility. And it's also just reminding them that you're there. I think the other side of the spectrum is a lot of queer folk that are like, you need to come out now, you need to do it now. I did it, it was great. We all come from different experiences and different walks. So for me to assume that my walk is the same for you is completely backwards in my thinking. I had an experience once where I was able to travel to Jordan in the Middle East, and my understanding of the queer experience was really different when I went there. Because I came out about 4 years ago. So I came out in my later years. So like for me, it was like, oh, I need to tell everybody about it. I'm excited. I finally stepped into who I am. I'm ready to embrace it. But when I went to Jordan, it was totally different. That people's lives are on the line if I were to offer that same advice. So like I mentioned that just to reference that not everyone's experience is the same. So we can't also, tell kids what you need is to come out. So it's just creating space where they feel supported in whatever decision they make.
Yeah, definitely.
When I have a student come in, it's my job to let them dictate what they want to do and give them the resources that they ask for. So I have to separate myself and my experience from it because it's not the same.
Yeah. No, I definitely have seen that. I have seen, sort of like the pressure to come out and saying that, you'll feel really great. It'll be really great, but that's not the case for everybody. And, you gotta respect other people's needs. Yeah, no, that is a really great answer. Thank you. So I did want to ask a couple questions about media representation. The first one being, where do you see positive representations of queer and trans people in TV or film?
Yes, the first one that comes to mind, and it was because it was just so impactful to me in my life, was the show Pose, FX show Pose by Ryan Murphy. For me, that was the first time where I saw queer brown stories. And that has never been something I have ever experienced as a person of color and as a queer man, simply because most queer stories and queer narratives have always been from the white perspective and the white experience. And, you know, that experience wasn't mine. So I always had to kind of take these stories that I would see in film and just adapt them to my life. But for me, that show was so impactful because it gave me history, queer history that I was not aware of, and also gave me a perspective that was mine. I saw myself in the film. I saw myself as that queer brown kid, and that was really impactful for me. And I know from that movement, there's been so much more visualization brought to the queer brown experience and the trans experience. Do I think that we've done enough? No. I think there's still a lot more work to do in representation, specifically, you know, with the trans communities, where I feel there's most work to be done. And yeah, I know one of the biggest people that I get much inspiration from is Billy Porter. He's an icon in queer culture, and just I love that he kind of sees his existence as like his ministry. Like, me being is my ministry and my purpose in life. So yeah, I think there's a lot of great work that's been done, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Because whether we want to accept it or not, queer and trans culture is trying to be erased. And we can't let that happen. And we know that the best forms of resistance is art and television and film. And it's those things that in this culture are being discredited, you know, and being pushed to the side and pushed to the parameters. But it's our responsibility to make sure that we keep representing these communities and representing them well. I know there was a lot of backlash with a couple, I think it was Transparent, that show, where, you know, they had a platform to talk about the trans community, but hired someone that wasn't trans. Mm-hmm. And it's like, what does that mean? What are you telling us? You know? So yeah.
Because I know there is a lot of representation out there that's not good, and it is harmful for people to be seeing that. But it's really great that you pointed out, you know, how much work we do still need to do, because there really is a lot. There are, you know, I know some people who sort of said like, oh, you know, we have so many queer stories, but we really don't. And, you know, you look at a lot of these queer stories, a lot of them are about cis white men. And there's really a lot of work that we still have to do. But a lot of people have brought up Pose, and
you know, and there's also to kind of touch on how that impacts people. I remember Sam Smith's second album. He released a second album, and he simply used, when he sang a love song, he used the pronoun him. And when I heard that like, it blew it totally shook up my perspective, and it made me see myself. And just a little thing of just saying, I love him, coming from a male identifying singer. Like, for me, that made me feel seen in a music world where that doesn't happen. Especially mainstream popular music. You know, of course, you know, there's been history of talking about, you know, queer and trans love, but it's always been underground. So like the simple thing of just hearing that pronoun be openly sung by a pop artist changed my life, you know, and helped me see myself in places that I never saw myself.
Yeah. That really happened to me when I was in high school, and I heard the song Girls Like Girls by Hayley Kiyoko, and I saw the video, and I was like, because she gets played on the radio, like I heard on, like, you know, the local like pop music station, that it's like her songs are on there, and she's very open that she writes love songs about women, and it's just, that was really revolutionary for me to hear that it wasn't hinted at, you know, it was open.
I was just saying, representation matters. Representation saves lives. I have no qualms going to that extreme. You know, how many times, you know, I have no qualms sharing, I'm a suicide survivor. And a part of me wanting to go down that road was because someone outed me and threatened to tell the school. And I wish I would have had representation through the music that I listened to and the films that I saw, because I wouldn't have built up so many years of just self-deprecating and like tearing myself down, you know? So like representation saves lives.
But the specificity of that representation matters, right? And we've talked a little about intersectionality and about pose. And like the first mainstream representation of queer folks that I ever saw on screen was when Ellen came out in her TV show, and I was in high school. And everyone was like so excited, and it was like, this is revolutionary. And I was like, I don't know, Ellen's like a conventionally feminine, pretty, funny millionaire. Like, I don't know how much that has to do with my life, you know?
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. I don't know if y'all, the show Queer Eye, the reboot, you mentioned intersectionality, and I remember season 5, the first episode that aired was following this man who grew up in the church, and when he came out as an adult, he kind of didn't know where to find his place, and that's so connected with my story, and just seeing that and hearing that you're not alone, because I feel like what our mind tries to tell us and society tries to tell us is that we're alone and that you just need to sit down. No one else is like you, so sit down. But that's the patriarchy at work, and that's so far from the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did also want to ask you about where you see positive representations of queer and trans people in kids and youth books.
I'll be honest, I have not seen much, but I'm also not connected to that world. I don't have children. I don't have, and I don't work with children, which kind of identifies a gap where, because I know that there's a lot of great children's books coming out, specifically for brown kids and queer kids, and trans kids. You know, I love it. Like I know but the gap that I identify is, okay, past that, where else do we see in literature? And I don't see it. I don't see it in literature. I don't see it. Yeah. So to answer your question, I know that there's a lot of great work happening, but I guess past children's books, I feel like there's still a lot of more work that needs to happen.
Yeah, that is a really good point, because I feel like that used to not be something anybody ever talked about in children's books, but there are a lot of children's books that are coming out. But yeah, I mean, kind of beyond that, like a lot of books for adults, there seems to be less representation.
Yeah, I remember growing up, I would always, you know, in my teenage years, I would always, you know, go to, you know, the queer bookstore, and it was like this taboo place that you would never go to. You know, you put on your hoodie when you walk in, but like we need more spaces like that. You know, queer bookstores were the lifeline for a lot of people growing up, and we need more of that, so that there is this large expanse of queer literature out there that people aren't exposed to, that we need to expose folks to.
Yeah. Yeah. And queer bookstores are fading, like queer bars, right? It's like a downside of greater inclusion in general, that now that you can find Ellen's book or whoever's in a mainstream bookstore, it's like maybe doesn't feel as urgent to have more specifically queer spaces. But those weren't only bookstores, right? They were like community hubs.
Yes. I love that you mentioned that, because I know when I first came to Vermont, I was just like, I moved from Boston, actually, the greater Boston area, and I was thriving and really looking for that queer community. And I remember a lot of folks telling me when they got here, like, oh, there's no queer spaces because it's inclusive, and you know, we don't need queer spaces because all spaces are queer spaces. And I'm like, that's beautiful, I appreciate it, but no, because as we know that The patriarchy doesn't, like, you don't draw a line and say like, oh, it ends here. No, we need
Yeah.
intentional spaces that are meant for queer and trans folks.
That is such a big thing living here. I'm so glad you brought that up because, yeah, it is a really inclusive community, but that doesn't mean that we don't need queer and trans spaces, because we absolutely do. We need to have a community here, even if most of the people living here are accepting. That doesn't erase the need for our community. Really doesn't.
So I work in the field of restorative justice, and in restorative justice we talk about intent and impact, and I think that in creating these fully inclusive spaces, our intent is there, but it doesn't mean that there's still not harm happening in those safe spaces. You know what I mean? Because wokeness is not something you like wake up and you're like, I get it, I'm an ally. No, you're gonna do harm. You're going to do harm as an ally. Accept it, embrace it, and create a system where you can process your own feelings. But with that being said, separating intent and impact, if we have all these completely inclusive spaces and not queer or trans specific spaces, there's still harm that's going to be done. And it's just an other space where I, as a queer man, need to explain something. And that's not my job. That's not in a safe space. I don't have to explain my experience. I'm with people who understand my experience.
Absolutely.
I so appreciate that. And it highlights really the difference between, like, are we a queer friendly space or are we a queer space? Being inclusive to a thing that's already really set up around the needs and wants and culture of straight people, it doesn't really do it for me.
Yeah, it's like, it's great that I won't be bullied and belittled for my identity here, but that doesn't mean it's the space that I really need.
Yeah. Yep.
So I did want to ask you actually about your work in restorative justice. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So restorative, I work specifically in the realm of restorative practices. So restorative justice is a culture change that really came in wanting to shift from punitive practices to more restorative practices when harm is done, specifically with the imprisoned population, but kind of recognizing that for some strange reason, schools decided to police children and youth the same way they police prisoners. That school to prison pipeline was like cemented. So like those same punitive practices in an attempt for equity, actually, they thought, well, let's just treat everyone the same way and not ask questions about what's going on. But restorative practices says, no, we got to interrupt that. So restorative practices says, when harm is done, we have to understand everything that's underneath that. What's the underbelly of conflict that's happening there? And how can we restore people who have been harmed into a space where they feel they have their basic needs met to move forward, whatever that looks like. And it's a very, I hate the term, but victim-informed process where we let folks who have been harmed really decide what the process is going to look like. But with that being said, it also looks at the harm doer, and it also creates empathy and compassion for them also, and says, what happened for you to cause this harm? And how can we as a community rally together to support you in your learning also? And more than just when harm happens, it's also a big community building piece. So I see the work of restorative practices through the lens of like 80-20. So 20% conflict resolution and 80% harm repair, but 80% community building. We're spending 80% of our time and our efforts, both professionally and personally, building the fibers of a relationship with people and communities so that when things go awry, there's trust and relationship there so that we can process things out. I really see the work of restorative practices as a way of being with each other and really calling us back to a very human part of us that believes that people aren't dispensable. That when they do things wrong or there's harm that's caused, we don't just throw them away. they're still a part of our community. The good, the bad, the ugly, the difficult. But what I like about this process is that I call it hand-holding and butt kicking. So there's support, full community support on all sides, but also there's a piece of accountability that needs to happen. So like when it comes to that realm of accountability, it says more than just the person that you harmed, but how did this impact the community? How did this impact you? And that reflective process is such a core part of the practice.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, no, it's really, really important work. I'm really glad that we got to talk to you about that.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, in my research of restorative work, I think it needs more. It's a process and a practice that I feel that our queer and trans community needs more of, because their experiences need to be heard. I remember I did a harm repair circle with a trans student who was the harm doer. And that was really hard for me to really create that space, but I had to understand that their experience was a result of a system, you know, and restorative practices made space for that, you know, because a punitive system wouldn't make space for that. They would assume that this student did harm, and they did do harm. I can't take that away. They did harm, but they never would have understand what were the reasons that brought them there. Because in that space, we got to learn that they've been bullied significantly in their school, and the only outlet they had was to cause harm to someone else. We never would have gotten that story if we didn't go through that process. So for me, restorative practice is so important in working with our trans and queer folks because it gives them a voice.
Thank you.
And not all of the violence that queer and trans kids experience is homophobic or transphobic violence. Some of it is just like plain old interpersonal violence from people they know and are in relationships with, where people are taking out their trauma on each other. And that also needs to be addressed to make a community that's safe for queer and trans youth. I was also especially excited to have you participate because I do a lot of work with teachers and with therapists who want to make a queer inclusive environment. And one of the things they often try to do in terms of policies to have a zero tolerance policy for bullying or homophobia or whatever. Right, I see you shaking your head. And it's the zero tolerance so often ends up hurting the very people that want to help because of who's already like over surveilled, like paid too much attention to or over policed in the school system. So you say zero tolerance for calling each other homophobic names, and then the people who get in trouble for that end up being the people who would have gotten in trouble anyway, which are poor kids, which are kids of color, disabled kids, and queer and trans kids also.
Yeah, and then when they're punished, you know, and let me know if the data does show this, but they do get queer and POC folks get harsher punishment.
Yes, absolutely.
Which gives them just another layer, you know. And to circle back what you said, I agree with you. Hurt people. That's really the phrase of restorative practices. We have to understand that when people hurt others, the majority of the time is because they were hurt also. And we need processes that create space for that sharing to happen. I rolled my eyes at zero tolerance because zero tolerance makes the assumption that we're all the same and we all need the same. And that is so far from the truth. So far from the truth. Because, you know, our white male cis brothers, they don't understand the experiences of other folks. They don't know what it's like to walk into a room. And I had a good friend of mine once in grad school. He told me that whenever he walks into a room, he feels the same trauma of having to come out every single time he enters a space. And I was like, shit, that's real. And we all know what that feels like, that tense up, that like, will they know? Will they see it? What happens if they see it? What am I gonna say? Lower my voice. Things like that folks don't understand happens when you walk into a space.
Yeah. Thank you. So, before we get into the more specific questions related to intersectionality, I did want to ask, what do you wish that you learned as a kid or youth about gender and sexuality that you didn't learn until later?
Great question. So I grew up in a religious household. I grew up Seventh-day Adventist, and there was always that assumption of conceal, don't show it, push it down. And I wish I would have learned at a young age that, well, before I say that, I was really blessed with a beautiful family that when I came out, they fully embraced me and they loved every piece of me, and I stand in the fact that not everyone has that experience. So I wish that I would have learned at an early age. I would have trusted that my family's going to love me and that I'm going to love myself, because I think that was the biggest fear. The biggest fear was that everyone's going to hate me for this choice. So as mentioned, I grew up in a religious household, and I was a chaplain for a large part of my professional career. So I continued my work in the church until I realized that I couldn't do this anymore. I had to choose. I couldn't be my full self if I could not acknowledge this piece of me. And the fear behind all of that was that I was going to get cut off, that no one would want to engage with me anymore. And the truth is that did happen, but I also met people who did embrace me. And I wish I would have known that earlier. I wish I would have known that there are still other people who would still embrace you and love you.
Thank you. So I know we were talking actually about rural areas earlier, but I did want to follow up with that first and then ask, oops, I have to scroll up. Oh no. Where is it? Having a rough day. How might queer and trans youth in rural areas have different needs than in cities? And how can rural areas be supportive places for queer and trans youth and adults?
Great question. This is my first time really living in a rural community, and access is really important here. Folks don't have access to, specifically in Vermont's area. Again, when we mentioned earlier of this idea of inclusion, so we don't need specific queer spaces. But even with that being said, I think the biggest thing that folks need in this area are access to other queer folk. That's so important. And I think a lot of the issues within rural communities, and I don't want to fall into assumption that, rural areas are less open-minded, but, facts are facts. And I think in rural communities, that idea of a more open idea to having different types of people around is always a difficult barrier to cross. So I think that is very unique to rural communities. Yeah, I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, access is so important in making those specific spaces.
Yeah, which just again goes back to we need specific queer spaces, and I love that locally they've done some really great local drag shows. That's been something that's been growing slowly in this area. But the most recent one got closed down again, so it's how can we do this?
The thing that actually I felt most included by in the local community was when I was in high school. There were these social events. They were kind of like dances, but there's also food there and stuff, and you could meet people at the Junction Youth Center specifically for LGBTQ youth. I think it was 15 to 20, or I think was the age range. I met a lot of really great people there. It was really, it felt a lot more genuinely inclusive than spaces that are just sort of say they're inclusive, but, you know, aren't designated for queer and trans people, because it was a space that was particularly for us, you know, where we could meet each other, where we could be open about our identities. You know, it was
Yes.
great.
I also think of, like, I'm really grateful for what technology has done for areas like this. You know, I grew up with like Adam for Adam and like Grindr and Scruff and these apps that, yes, you know, they have this like sexual connotation of hooking up, but there's also a great community that comes out of that, you know, and these apps that have been coming out to just create a space where there is none. You know what I mean? And meet people that you would not meet in your normal day to day, you know? So like those spaces are also really important. So like I give props to, I'm not too hip on the most recent apps, but there's probably plenty of apps where these small communities get to connect and meet other people.
Yeah, and that might be a really great thing for parents to know in terms of it is true that folks use these apps not only for hookups, even if they really are designed that way. And it's hilarious sometimes. I mean, I've found my physical therapist through a hookup app. Like I found consulting clients that way. I mean, it is, I met somebody on a hookup app who had just lost their cat, and I found their cat for them in the shelter system. Like, it is just another community space that was initially organized in this really specific way, but actually fills many other needs. And so if you're a parent who finds that your 18-year-old is on a hookup app and you feel concerned or scandalized, like, yeah, talk with them about internet safety, but also know that that's not necessarily the only thing that's going on there.
Yes, thank you for sharing that, because it's so true. You know, I met my partner. We met on an app. You know, there's so much more that space is for.
I love that cat story so much.
Yeah.
I mean, I just love cats, but it is a really great. It's a really great point about, you know, the community on these apps. You know. All
The
right.
bad reputation of getting people to take home new cats, even someone I just met for 2 seconds on a hookup app.
All right. So my last couple questions are related to intersectionality. The first one being, what particular barriers do queer and trans youth of color face, and what particular strengths and assets do they bring, and what could adults in the community do to make it more welcoming for queer and trans youth of color?
I think the first thing is to remember that the queer and trans POC experience is different. I think, you know, there's this patriarchal culture has in some way hijacked queer culture, where it's like you have to be the yes queen type of queer, you know what I mean? And it's like, or queer culture and trans culture has now adopted this idea that like you have to be this way, you know, and that is the antithesis of what queer culture and trans culture is about. It's about me choosing to be myself, you know, and I think what we need is that first realization that our experiences is different. It's completely different, which requires different responses and different strategic moves to be made to be able to meet those needs. Mm-hmm. And I think what institutions and community spaces need to recognize is that it's their responsibility to do their own work. And it's also their responsibility to identify leaders capable of leading that work. I have my brother-in-law, he works with Planned Parenthood. And one of the things he always advocates for is making sure that people working in these communities come from these communities. You know what I mean? So that, again, to our point earlier of representation, I don't need a a cis queer man telling me about my queer experience, because it's not going to land. You know, I'll be kind and I will listen and I will thank you, but there was no transformation there for me. So I feel that what spaces need to do is do their own work and also identify community folk who can assist them in this work to take it further.
Yeah.
I think the confusion that a lot of people think is that allies are the same as members, and they're not the same, and they hold different roles. So yeah, I think that's really important in this work. Doing the work on my own and also identifying, recognizing my own limits, and identifying folks who can meet that gap.
Thank you. That's a really great point. Yeah, I know, like, the thing with people viewing like allies as filling the same role as members of these communities, it's just really not accurate. You know, but it is pervasive. It does persist in a lot of these places.
Yeah, and it's not this like exclusionary at all. Like, I see it as like a community within a community. You know what I mean? Just because I have this smaller community doesn't mean I'm separated from this larger community. It just means that we as human beings have depth and we are completely intersectional, and we need the larger community just as much as we need the smaller community. You know, I really love how the local racial justice center here in Brattleboro runs their meetings, where like white allies and POC gather together initially, and then they separate into their respective affinity groups, and then come back together. So it's like, it's the larger community is there, but the smaller community is just as important. And it doesn't mean and it is excluded, but experiences are different. And I love it. I love it when organizations like set that boundary of like, no, this is not a space for you. Like that makes my heart smile.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh no, you're good. I just said that makes my heart smile when like that intention in making sure that spaces stay just what they're supposed to be is valuable.
Thank you. Which racial justice center is that? Brattleboro is very far away from where I am.
It's in Brattleboro.
The Root, right?
Yes, the Root.
Oh, yes.
The Racial Justice Center.
So you must know my friend Sheila.
Oh, Sheila, yes.
So great.
She is a beautiful soul.
Yeah, we've done some good training stuff together. She's amazing.
She is, and she's such a critical piece of our community.
Mm-hmm.
Critical for POCs and our queer trans youth. She's doing it, and she has a lot of mountains to face. You know, working in rural Vermont is not easy. It's not easy. So yeah, I'm so glad that we made that connection.
Yeah. No, like I work a lot of times. I feel sort of just with where I live, like a lot of work is not happening here, but there is actually a chapter of Surge in the Upper Valley that I've worked with. So that's really great. We also have the Upper Valley DSA, which does, you know, a lot of work with intersectionality related as well. It's unfortunately the Surge meetings are always at the exact same time as my group therapy, and I just like, no, I want to go. Like, why can't I do this?
What does Surge stand for?
Oh, it's showing up for racial justice.
Okay, sweet.
It's a national organization that has like local chapters, and we have one in the Upper Valley, which is really great.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. I'm going to read up on that organization, actually.
Yeah.
Some of my favorite co-facilitators are a part of that group also, because small world.
Oh, yes. Very small. I also wanted to ask, what particular barriers do disabled and or neurodivergent LGBTQ people face? And what particular strengths and assets do they bring? And what could adults in the community do to make it more welcoming for these youth?
Thank you for that question. And this is a learning zone for me. You know, I'm new to working with neurodivergent folks, and I find that it's tough because I've recently realized that like the system that we currently have to identify neurodivergent folks is like rooted out of ableism, like rooted in ableism.
That is so
and
accurate.
rooted in racism and ableism and transphobia. Like it's so sickening, but this is the system that we are in. You know, when I find that the biggest barriers, a lot of it happens with trans folk, where like they need their like medical paperwork, and it's like we have to stick to that and only what's on paperwork, but they're not realizing the impact that that has on students. And I think it's hard to restructure that system because it's been put in this light of like, we're helping folk, you know, this is the system here to support, but it's so rooted in ableism. Just thinking about how folks go through the process of being identified as having a learning difference is just, again, rooted in the practice of ableism.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up because, yeah, all of these ways that neurotypical people define neurodivergence is just, and that's how it's defined in the medical world, is by neurotypical people, by neurotypical standards. And also, I hear so much of like, are we over-diagnosing autism and things like that? I also hear that with ADHD too, and it's like, no, we are not. And it's like, it's just, it feels so wrong to hear that when people of color, when women, non-binary people, really all trans people, just there are so many communities who are never acknowledged as neurodivergent because, you know, that doesn't fit the, you know, what the people who are diagnosing are thinking about. And you know, the reason some people are saying that we're overdiagnosing it is also based in these totally ableist standards, like, oh, people who can socially function and have jobs are being diagnosed with autism. They're being diagnosed with ADHD, being diagnosed with dyslexia. And it's like, that you're just so wrong about what that means. And it's...
And I feel like there's always this picture of, and I detest this word, that back to the picture of like, what's normal?
Yes.
And it always goes back to, okay, what mold are we creating these systems out of? And that's the question we always have to ask. Because I see it every day in our student population. We are about 85% male identifying. And that's the spectrum with, and that's what research shows, that most people who are identified at a young age are male.
Yeah.
which again reinforces the problem. The very structure that was created to fix the problem is reinforcing the problem.
100%.
Yeah, Claire, I really appreciate what you said about overdiagnosis, because I'm like, because there's an assumption that's often embedded in that question of like, are we overdiagnosing? Or sometimes people ask, are we underdiagnosing? And like in both cases, I think the answer is so much less relevant than the question and like the motivation of the question. And like, are you asking because you assume that growing numbers of this diagnostic category is bad? And if you're assuming that a category is bad, then that already says that we're doing something wrong there with how we're understanding humans.
And that's a lot of things about the way that people talk about neurodivergence within the medical model.
Yeah.
Like when people will say, I mean, this happens with all types of neurodivergence. I just, as an autistic person, I particularly know a lot about the medical model of autism. When people will say, oh, doing this in pregnancy creates a risk of autism.
Right.
Like when you're saying a risk, you know, you're putting it in a frame that like, this is a bad thing and people should do whatever is in their power to prevent having an autistic child, which is so much, the language is so important.
Yeah, and it reinforces this negative connotation, like you mentioned, this other. Instantly, it creates another.
Yeah.
And I want to say too, because I think it hasn't come up yet, and it has to at some point, there's a very troubling overlap between pathologizing transness and pathologizing neurodivergence. And one of the ways that it happens is that when a kid is both, medical providers will often like make them pick one kind of. And with other kinds of, not just with autism, although that comes up a lot, but also with like all kinds of mental health diagnoses where young people will be told like, oh, I hear you that you're exploring gender and that you want to transition, but first we need to stabilize your moods. And after that, if you're still trans, then we can figure that out, right? Yeah. Or especially people who are diagnosed with intellectual disabilities, like, oh, well, you just must be confused. Like, you must just not be understanding that. And occasionally I've even seen it happen in the opposite direction, where someone like as an adult or a young adult is saying like, you know, I think I might be autistic. Like, can I get some assistance to understand myself better and like figure out what I might want to do about this? And people are like, you're not autistic, you're just awkward because you're trans, right? And it's like, wow, like the lack of complexity there, that it's as if like from a sort of neurotypical and cisgender perspective, either of those ways of being is so weird that you couldn't possibly be both. But of course you could totally be both. And also like stabilizing your mood does not make you less trans, right? And also like getting awkward because of social norms of transition like does not make you autistic or less autistic. But people just really need one to be a cause of the other for some reason, rather than just thinking like maybe sometimes both are true.
Yeah.
Both deserve the same amount of level of response.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the same amount of like respecting what somebody says about what response they need, right?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Really glad that you brought that up. Is there anything else that you would like to tell us?
I'm feeling an overwhelming sense of just gratitude for this project and for collecting these stories and asking these questions. I wish there was more of it, honestly. I truly, truly hope so.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited about this project. I'm really glad I got to be a part of it. I'm really glad that it exists, and I'm really glad that you decided to participate. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we did it. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank y'all.